Welcome to Tripping Over Love, where we talk all about breakdowns, breakups, and breakthroughs. I'm Courtney Corona with Keith Miller. Hey there, thanks for coming back to Tripping Over Love. Today we are talking all about not having kids, the whole history behind it.
Yeah, how do you feel about that? We're going to be talking to Dr. Peggy O'Donnell Heffington. She's a professor of history at the University of Chicago, and she wrote this book called Without Children, The Long History of Not Being a Mother. So, what's coming up for you? I have kids, you don't have kids. You get asked this question a lot.
One of the things that you had asked was, how do you feel when you're asked whether you have kids or not? And I was saying 9 times out of 10, I don't have a family that pushes me. I don't have friends that push me. My experiences at work have been my own problems, meaning I will go to work, and when I'm there, I have this feeling that because I don't have kids, I should be the one who's staying home late.
People have treated you differently, definitely because you don't have kids at times.
Yeah, at times. But I would also say I also was not creating the right boundaries because I had guilt of not having kids. And I felt like, oh, well, you're more important because you have children. So you go spend the holidays with them. This is when I was a journalist and you worked on holidays. You go spend the holidays with family. It's okay if I work because I don't have kids. So there's that. But I think the hardest thing for me, honestly, is when you and I are having conversations with people and you're talking about their kids, they're talking about their kids, and they look at me, oh, do you have kids? No, I don't. And then it's like, well, hell, I don't know what to ask you. And so many times, especially with your friends who are a little bit older than me, and I say that because
sure,
they have you know, we're talking not a huge bit, but 8-10 years.
Almost all the friends I have kids.
Yeah.
That's a fact.
I can't think of any of your friends that don't have kids. But I was saying that they're older because I'm still at an age where it's possible, but at that age you've already sort of moved through life and have engaged with probably most likely the majority of people have kids. So it is kind of they don't know how to respond.
Yeah, well, and if you're not in that world of parenting and having kids, it's hard to imagine what that world is like or be interested in it. Peggy talks about her own experiences, and this is just fascinating, of writing this book and finding solidarity with moms. We talk about this. And that moms responded to her book saying, thank you. You've explained to me why I find it so hard to be a mother. So Peggy actually was writing a book about not having kids, but it ended up being a long history of motherhood as well. Interesting fact, there's no word for a non-mother.
Non-mother doesn't sound as negative, but childless is, you pointed out, is without.
Right. And childfree is really a more of an embrace.
Right, which
was
it sounds like started in the 70s around freedom and all of that. But yeah, it's an interesting conversation, and I respect mothers already. When I watch my nephews, I am, for a couple of hours, I'm exhausted and I can't imagine how people navigate all of that. But the book does introduce, or it did for me, introduce even more of what's happening societally that is really putting pressure on moms. So it opened my eyes to a lot too. And hopefully, as Peggy said, lessening the divide between mothers and non-mothers.
I think this will spark a lot of good conversation. Here's Dr. Peggy O'Donnell Heffington. Dr. Peggy Heffington, nice to be with you today. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. We read your book, and it's fascinating. It is called Without Children, The Long History of Not Being a Mother. Curious if you want to tell people why this topic you teach at University of Chicago, which is dear to my heart, as I've shared with you, and you're in the history department there. Tell us a little bit about where this book comes from for you personally and in your career.
So I came to this book in a little bit of a roundabout way for a historian, for an academic. It is not what I wrote my dissertation on. It is not really connected to what I studied in graduate school. It came from my personal experience of graduating from my PhD program, I was in Berkeley, and moving to take my first job at the United States Military Academy at West Point, which was a real culture shock in a lot of ways. And one of the ways that sort of, throughout the year I was at West Point that became sort of something I really fixated on was that I'd spent almost a decade living in California, surrounded by graduate students and, tech workers who were in their 20s and 30s, who just absolutely did not seem like having kids was on their radar really at all. Like it was something that was off in the far future, or maybe we'll do that. And I moved to West Point, and I was suddenly surrounded by women who were my age, many of whom were Army officer wives, who had 2 or 3 kids. and on paper, they were college educated, they were upper middle or upper class, they tended to be white. And, on paper, they didn't look that different from the graduate student population that I had come from at Berkeley. And yet there were these massive cultural differences. And so I found myself thinking, how did we get to a place where in some parts, having children remains sort of normal and the path that people take. And then in other parts of the country or other sort of cultural groups, it's not anymore.
There's almost like 2 countries with this issue as there is with many.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was so jarring to me that it kind of got my historian mind thinking, like, how did we get to this place? And I found myself, trying to pay attention to the context in which these women on an army base in New York were living, and what is available to army families. It's free healthcare, subsidized daycare, subsidized housing. And also something that really struck me was, because these are families that move all the time, there is like real infrastructure, like social infrastructure for welcoming new people in, for providing material support to each other, providing emotional support to each other. I can't count the number of times I overheard a one mom say to another mom, like literally knock on our door anytime we have the coffee pot on, just 24 hours a day.
Community.
So there was this community piece. And I was thinking, what is missing everywhere else? It's, affordable healthcare. It's support. It's, affordable housing. It is community support like that in material terms. And so that again got me thinking as a historian, like, how did we get to this point where, large parts of our society are not feeling, that kind of support, those factors that are necessary to have large families.
Yeah, I'm curious too. So I don't have kids. Keith does, but I don't. And obviously, as a historian, I imagine the question why comes up a lot for you, and wondering how things have evolved. But do you also feel, I'm saying this from a personal perspective, I tend to look at either like dynamics at work and all sorts of things, and I notice the difference between, say, a woman who has children and one who doesn't, and really how they go about their work relationships and how that works and all of it. Was that playing a part in your curiosity, your own internal discussion about whether, you should be having kids or not, or had you hit that point in your life yet, or no?
It just hadn't really been on my radar, because I had been living in this context where everyone was really focused on their jobs, right? Like, I was around PhD students, some of whom were, dating or married to tech workers who worked 100 hours a week at Google. And it was something that just seemed very far off, both, whether it was financially, we're all broke, grad students who like couldn't imagine having another mouth to feed, or tech workers who just don't, it didn't have time. And so it really was eye-opening to sort of encounter people whose priorities were really radically different, and who were sort of moving through the world with other things at the forefront of what they were doing with their time. But I also just was not satisfied. Like, the academic in me was not satisfied by saying, like, okay, so just like culturally in the Bay Area, everyone is like really into their jobs, and culturally here on this military base, everyone is into having kids. Like that, it just didn't seem like that was a satisfying explanation. So that's why I started looking for these more sort of structural factors of like what are the sort of material or support or economic factors underlying people's like expressions of priorities or desire.
Why does this matter now all of a sudden? I mean, I know that's a big question.
Or is it really all of a sudden?
Has it always mattered? Has there always been a cultural kind of hot stove feeling about this? But it seems like it's ratcheted up right now about people who have kids and don't have kids.
I think that it has always been a factor, that you can go very far back in certainly American history, certainly the history of Western Europe, certainly the history of sort of the Judeo-Christian world. And there is like a lot of value placed on, the reproduction and sort of the role of women in reproduction. Right.
And you told a story about Napoleon and just this awful quote that the way he referred to women as basically useless objects unless they were bearing children.
Yeah. And I mean, you can go back through a lot of history and find, powerful men making these statements about sort of the correct role of women. And Napoleon at the sort of the dawn of the age of the nation state in the early 19th century in Europe, you have leaders who are really concerned about population, right? They think that the way to make your nation state stronger is to have more people in it. And who do you need to do that? You need women to have the children. You can see sort of similar quotes from men in power in the United States in the 19th and early 20th centuries, where they're really sort of conceptualizing women's correct civic duty, like their duty as citizens is to be creating more citizens. One of the quotes that I always love going back to is Theodore Roosevelt in 1905 gives this speech where he compares women who don't have children to soldiers who run away in battle. Like the implication
Wow.
is very clear that it is like your civic duty, just like men is to serve their country, in the military is to have children and create more citizens for the country. And so I think at moments when you see women sort of starting to limit their fertility, you have these anxieties pop up. Like in the United States in the 19th century, fertility falls really dramatically. Basically, from the beginning of the 19th century to the end, fertility in some groups cuts in half, from about 7 births per woman at the beginning of the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, white women in the North are having about 3.5. So this is like really dramatic, and sort of across race, across class, North and South, women are fertility is declining among all groups of women, and this is in part because infant mortality rates are dropping, so you don't need to have as many kids. You don't need to have 7 kids if you want to end up with 4 or 5. You can just have the 4 or 5. It's also because in the 19th century, the United States is transitioning from a rural economy to an industrial economy. It's transitioning from primarily rural, like people living in the countryside, to people living primarily in cities. So if you don't have a big farm, you probably don't need 7 kids to work on your farm. And in fact, if you're living in a tenement apartment in the city, having fewer kids is probably desirable. But at the same time as fertility is dropping in the 19th century, you see really extreme anxieties that are, in some ways resonant to today. Laws start getting passed. At the beginning of the 19th century, there are no laws restricting abortion anywhere in the newly founded United States. And across the 19th century, every single state passes laws against it, and by the 1870s, it's illegal at a federal level. So there are these just as fertility is falling, you start getting people concerned about restricting the ability of women to limit their fertility.
So you see a direct connection between those two, the decision to ban abortion.
Yeah, I think so. And there's people talking really explicitly about it, that I mentioned that fertility falls the fastest among white women. It falls the fastest among educated women, among wealthy women. For people in power, these are exactly the kinds of women that you want having children. Like they are sort of the women who would be producing the most desirable births from a nativist, from a eugenicist sort of perspective. And so it creates a lot of anxiety to see precisely that group limiting their fertility. And you have people talking explicitly about how throughout the 19th century that the birth rates among immigrant women or women of color are outpacing those of white women born in the United States. So I do think that there's like a lot of anxiety going on there about what kind of babies are being born, who is thinking, about limiting their fertility, that I do think there are real parallels to today. But I also think that there's just a broader anxiety of, if women are no longer having 7, 8, 9, 10 births and rounds of breastfeeding, so they're not spending 10, 15 years sort of directly in the project of creating and sustaining brand new life, like what are they going to do with their time? And so another thing that you see in the 19th century is sort of this valorization of motherhood. Historians call it Republican motherhood, that it is not only women's civic responsibility to have kids, but there's sort of this expansion of what it means to like raise a citizen. So women are expected to do much more intensive parenting in the 19th century. And you do have people sort of explicitly saying, if women don't have enough kids, they're not going to have enough to do. They're going to want law degrees. They're going to want to vote, So I think there's an anxiety about like, how women are spending their time and what is sort of the appropriate way for women to be spending their time.
You write about how you started to develop a sense of solidarity with mothers. You write that you're not a mother yourself, but I'm curious how and why. Like, what are the bridges that you discovered that made you feel closer to mothers?
One of the projects that I was trying to do with this book was to sort of complicate the way we talk about having and not having children in the present. I think we tend to talk about it as a question of desire. Like if you want kids, you're going to have them. And if you don't want kids, you're not going to have them. And in my own personal experience, and I think historically, it's just not that clear. Like there are a whole variety of factors that are creating a context in which someone makes reproductive decisions. So like their job, their economic situation, the support that they have, all of these things sort of play into what decisions are possible for them. And so I found myself, as I was thinking along those lines of like, what are the factors in the present and in the past that have shaped women's ability to make reproductive decisions? I started realizing that, what I was going to be telling was a history of a society, of the United States, increasingly making decisions that made it harder to parent, that made it harder, that sort of stripped support from families, that increased expectations on, what it meant to work, that chose to not provide universal daycare, that created this society where parenting was really hard. And the revelation for me was realizing that the reasons why women give when they're asked why they don't have children tend to be about support. They tend to be about money. They tend to be about their jobs. These are the exact same things that make parenting hard. and so it suddenly occurred to me that, whether we have children or not, people are sort of grappling with this same set of societal decisions that make parenting difficult, and that should be something that like unites us rather than divides us. That, if someone chooses not to have children because they lack support, and someone is struggling to parent with a lack of support, like they have more in common actually than I think we tend to think about it as a society.
One of the things I find really fascinating is the holistic, if we look at government overall, the decisions to ban abortion, to do things that encourage, continued birth. But then in parallel to that, or the contradiction to that, is not providing, universal daycare and all of those things as well. But as you were just talking, I was realizing, well, one is, pushing for, no way of stopping a birth. The other one is allowing women to have children and then be part of society. Mm-hmm. Right. And so is the difference there the decision on whether women are home, forced to take care of the kids, they're the ones who have to be the daycare because there's no other daycare or anything along those lines, versus creating a society where women can have children, but they also are able to be, in the workforce and they have the support. Is that where those decisions are coming from?
Yeah, I think you're really on to something there. This book, I thought I was setting out to just write a history of not having children. And what the book ended up being, in spite of the title, which still says it as a history of not having children, was a history of the transformation of the American family from the colonial period into the sort of middle of the 20th century. Historians have documented that in the colonial period and basically everywhere else on Earth, raising children was like a very communal act. One historian has put it that, for colonial Americans, like they only understood the family in the context of the community. And so, people lived in homes that basically had the nuclear family, but in very literal material ways. They were involved in each other's lives. It was very common for families to send kids to go live with another family for a while or permanently. Women passed in and out of houses, out of each other's lives. They loved each other's children. They parented each other's children. They even passed kids back and forth. And so there was this way in which, your own reproductive status didn't matter that much because, it did in sort of, I don't mean to say that women struggling with infertility in the colonial period didn't feel pain, but in a lot of ways, their societal role was very similar to that of someone who had biological children of their own. And in fact, there's many documented cases of a couple that just never has children, probably because of some infertility issues, their siblings sending kids to go live with them because they've got a big empty house with lots of hands. So there was this real sense that the community and the family were intertwined. And in the 19th century, after the revolution, historians have debated, there's all kinds of reasons why this happened, but you see a really distinct move in the early 19th century away from this community model towards the isolation of the nuclear family, where, the nuclear family is then expected to be able to be a self-sufficient unit. By the 1840s, you have thinkers saying, this is the only way people have ever been in families. It's basically a little nation state, and it is totally self-sufficient. So there's this real sort of shift, and I argue that one of the effects of that is to isolate women who don't have children of their own, because now they're no longer really involved in the process of raising children. But it also isolates mothers because suddenly, it is entirely on them. If the nuclear family is a self-sufficient unit, that they should be able to sort of parent all on their own.
That was, for me, Peggy, that was like a big takeaway for me from your book, was just the sense of, wow, if I could snap my fingers and change one thing in sociology and that would help people, it would be to have this extended family, like is true in the southern hemisphere more than in the global north, right? There's the extended families, like our kids move out at age 17, 18, and we're seeing a lot of them come back and live much longer, sometimes up to a decade, many years back with their parents. So it seems like the natural thing to do is have a more extended, more extensive network.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the sociologist Patricia Hill Collins has this line in an essay that she wrote where she says, the nuclear family is not only the most unusual way of raising children in the world, it's also the most stressful.
It's so stressful. It's so stressful.
Courtney, to get back to your question, I'm a historian. I go way back to answer a question.
I love it.
But I really think that as the idea of the nuclear family and the family as this like self-sufficient biological unit became naturalized and it became understood as like the natural way of raising children, by implication, it meant that needing assistance from outside the family was unnatural, that it was like a failure in some way. And I think we can really see that like deep assumption playing out in a lot of ways in our politics today, that, in sort of a resistance to subsidize daycare, to provide assistance for families. Like, yeah, we want women to have kids. That's pro-life politics, right? Like, you can't end the pregnancy, but we're not going to help them out once those kids are born, because the nuclear family is supposed to be this self-sufficient unit. That is the natural way of things. Whereas I think, if we really thought about it, a pro-life politics would be about like raising those children and making sure that
there's something that happens after the birth, right?
Right, right.
There's needs that come.
Exactly.
Peggy, there was a section in your book that I thought at first was like a comedic section about birth control, in the old-fashioned birth control, coitus interruptus, like interrupting intercourse, right? Mm-hmm. And you listed all of these names and phrases that I was just like laughing my ass off about this. But then I realized, okay, there's a deeper point here. Can you tell us what some of those are?
Sure. I had a lot of fun. So the first chapter of the book is what I call the long history of not having children. And it is not a chapter I intended to write. It was not in the original book proposal. It was not something that I was thinking about. But then I realized as I was talking with people, that I was writing this book, I got the question a lot, even from people who are sort of very supportive of the idea of reproductive rights and birth control and abortion. They would say, how are you writing a long history of not having children? Like, wasn't the pill invented in the 1950s? Wasn't abortion made legal in 1972? And they'd be like, are you writing a history of like nuns and infertility? And I realized I needed to establish that actually, from all of the evidence we have, women have been actively trying to limit their fertility for basically as long as we have records. I mean, and so this sent me, going back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and there's these gynecological treatises that sound extremely hilarious about, all of these wild methods of trying to limit fertility. And some of them are just,
oh my God,
are nuts.
One of them is inserting a half of a lemon.
Yes,
oh,
right.
Ow.
And so I think this is ancient Greece, where they recommended inserting half of a lemon in front of the cervix before having intercourse, which sounds absolutely terrible. I imagine their lemons had to be smaller than our lemons today.
Yeah, but still the acid. Oh gosh.
But also horrible. Citric acid, which is a major component in lemon juice, has spermicidal properties.
Yeah, it works, doesn't it?
Fascinating. So it would have worked, which suggests to me that there was like a lot of trial and error going on before they landed on lemons, right?
Yeah.
So there is a lot of effort being sort of expended in figuring out how to prevent pregnancy. And in the ancient world and even into the medieval period, they weren't really thinking about the difference between preventing pregnancy and ending them once they started. Both of them were sort of preventing a birth, and so they didn't really think about it in that sort of sharp distinction the way we do today, which makes sense because they didn't really totally understand how conception worked or when it happened or how that went. But there were all of these sort of ingenious methods that people came up with, and the herbs in medieval medical treatises. There are all kinds of herbs that they tell you to take to prevent a pregnancy. And a lot of them are things that, doctors still today tell pregnant women not to consume as tea, because they would have worked at least some of the time. So I spent that chapter really establishing that, yes, modern birth control technology has made it much easier to limit births. And modern feminism has given like language to why we might want to limit births, but that doesn't mean that women weren't doing it for a very, very long time.
And there was like these were like derogatory terms for birth control, like
yes.
some of them, if I remember. Right?
Yeah, I'm struggling to remember some of them, but yeah, for coitus interruptus, there would be, throwing the seed upon stone, or kind of hilariously doing business in the suburbs, or terms that implied waste. But just the simple fact that there was slang for it suggests that it's something that the people are not only doing, but they're talking about it.
Why do you think so many people are so surprised that there was a form of birth control prior to the 1950s? And that, I mean, I recognize it's not part of what we learn as we're growing up, but it still kind of blows my mind that there's not this universal understanding, at least, that there were attempts to do that from either side, the male or female side.
Yeah, I mean, to me, like I said, it really surprised me that I needed to write this chapter, because to me, it just seems self-evident that, like, for as long as humans have been having babies, they've probably been trying to also not have them for a whole variety of reasons. Whether simply because they have enough of them and can't afford to feed more, or because they're having sex before marriage or whatever. I mean, the idea that people didn't do that until 1969 is just kind of nuts. Like, have you met people? But I do think, I think a couple of things. One is that we have sort of this presentist bias that, that the technology we have in the present is sort of revolutionary, not only from a technology standpoint, but from a sort of societal and cultural standpoint. So people just think like birth control, that was invented recently. But I also think that people just didn't really talk about it. What was new about the later decades of the 20th century was that you had feminists out there sort of articulating why it was hard to be a mother and why they might want to limit their fertility, why they should be able to have sex without, having necessarily the pregnancy result. And that in earlier periods, people were much quieter about it. The only time you see there's an example of a case from the 18th century in colonial Massachusetts, where a woman actually dies after a botched abortion. And that's one of the only records we have from that early on of an abortion happening. And it is only recorded because she dies. But if you look at the records we have, they have slang for abortion. All of her friends knew that she was attempting to end the pregnancy. Their families kind of all knew. So it suggests that people were just very, like, it was happening. People knew about it, but it wasn't something that was politically expedient to talk about. So I think it was just quieter. And that what was really revolutionary about the 20th century was that it sort of gave language to something that people were doing for a long time, much more quietly.
Yeah, and speaking about language, one of the other things that I found really fascinating in the book was your point that a woman without children is childless, whereas a woman with children actually has a noun attached to it, which is mother. And it just reminded me of like the many times where like Keith and I will be out and, he'll be talking about his kids and they'll ask me, do you have kids? And I'm like, nope, childless. And it just, even saying it just makes you feel ashamed. And I don't even know where my question is going with that, but it's just fascinating to me that there's no mother is so synonymous with women, whereas father is not the same. It doesn't have the same weight for a man. Mm-hmm. And I found that fascinating when you pointed that out. And that's to me the starkest difference.
Can I jump in a little bit? Because I was going to ask you both, or really, Peggy, if you want to answer this, you can. But for Courtney, how is it getting easier to deal with those questions? There's probably a relative in every person's family that just they know better than to ask. They know the answer to the question, but they're going to ask it anyway to make a point. How do you handle that? Is that getting easier or is it getting harder?
Peggy, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, to the point on language, it was something that I thought about, and the title of the book is very intentional. It's Without Children, rather than childless women, or because as you noted, I mean, the very word childless means that you're lacking something, right? Like it implies a lack of something.
You should have had it, and you don't have it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you think about older words like barren, right, which is how women without kids would have been described for a long time. I mean, it's a field where nothing will grow, right? Like it's like useless land. And so, I think there was an effort that has become more prominent, but starting in the 1970s that I talk about in the book, to sort of come up with different language. So the term child-free emerges in the 1970s, and I think is very common on the internet today. I didn't use that term in the book because it has its own history. Like it came up in a very particular moment in the 1970s, and also because I think it implies an intentionality, whereas with the book I was trying to sort of give an account of the full range of not having children, which only some of which was people sort of joyfully making the decision to be what we would call today child-free. But the book is much more about sort of the gray, the factors that go into limiting people's options. So yeah, there isn't really a good word for it. The Adrienne Rich makes the point that I think about all the time, that non-mother is a label that gets thrown around onto women like me and Courtney. The term non-father does not exist. We do not call men a non-father, right?
It's crazy.
Yeah. It's sort of like, father is a category term. It's a kind of man, but mother is like the inevitable result of a woman's life, right? Like you're supposed to go there, and if you don't go there, you're lacking something. To the question of whether it's getting easier, I mean, to dodge the personal question, I think it's not really intentionally, but I have a more interesting answer sort of societally. I think that young people are, just as someone who teaches them, who interacts with them, and who also observes them on the internet, I think young people are getting more comfortable with the idea of not having children as a valid lifestyle choice. And the example I'll point to is 2 summers ago when J.D. Vance's comments about childless cat ladies came back. It seemed to me that the sting of the insult of calling someone childless was really lacking, because almost immediately you had like women on the internet making T-shirts that said like childless cat ladies for Kamala, and you have Taylor Swift, labeling herself a childless cat lady. Like there was this real like reclamation of the term, and that's something that gives me hope for younger women, that that they're thinking in much more expansive ways about what reproductive options they have, and sort of they're actively stripping the stigma from that so many of us were subject to.
Talk about the idea that it's selfish to not have kids, and that and this is kind of a separate question too, but the people who, and I work with a lot of people who have just this existential fear. I mean, I think religion has faded, generally speaking, in our country, compared to like Puritan New England, right? But activism is kind of become its own form of religion, and some of that activism is important and necessary. But it's just constant. It's like an obsessive person pointing out all the problems and how it's all going to go wrong. And for a young person, and I wonder how my kids hear that. I think they do okay, remaining glass half full about this. At least I hope that's part of what they've inherited from me and our family. But selfish, scared.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I have a friend who regularly reminds me. This is what good girlfriends do. That when I will have moments when I'm like, well, if I'm not having kids, like, what is the awesome thing I'm going to do with my life? And she's always like, you don't have to do something extra awesome just because you don't have kids. And so, I mean, even I feel like I need that reminder that, like, I don't need to fill all that time and energy that I'm not spending on kids with something that's, like, you know, impressive enough to account for not having them.
But Peggy, arguably, I mean, you're spending more time with kids than I ever probably will. You are touching more children's lives, possibly including my child, and so that factors in, right?
Absolutely. And the story that the woman that I wrote about in the book who sort of stuck with me and that I returned to in this context is Ella Baker. So Ella Baker is you know, probably most famous for her civil rights work. She was a leader of the NAACP in the 1940s and 1950s, sort of really on the forefront. She was handing out pamphlets from the NAACP in Alabama in the 1940s. I mean, incredibly dangerous, brave work. She was born in the first couple years of the 20th century in Virginia, and in a sort of upwardly mobile Black family, sort of the part of the emerging Black middle class. But because her family was part of the Black community in the South, they were in contact with people sort of across the economic spectrum. And she wrote later that she was sort of raised in this very community-minded sense, that, like, if you had extra food, you gave it to somebody else. If, you know, her family mortgaged their house a couple of times to sort of raise funds to give out to the community. If somebody had farm equipment, they were going to share it with everybody else. If somebody had time to take care of someone's kids, they were going to do that. And that is sort of an ethos that she brought to her civil rights work. She lands in Harlem in the 1920s and sort of becomes connected with the Black community there. And then the Depression happens. And so she's sort of at the forefront of mutual aid societies where it's sort of the community caring for itself or caring for each other. And this was sort of the thinking that really shaped her life. And she did not have children and was fairly explicit that that was not of interest to her, because she knew that having children of her own meant that her resources of time and care and money would go towards her own children rather than sort of being things that she could inject back into the community. And so I think she is, like, this incredible example of how completely unselfish it is to have children. In fact, I think you could argue that it was the least, you know, an incredibly unselfish decision. It might have been selfish for her to decide to have children and then, you know, only be able to direct those resources to, you know, within her own home. And so this is something that I kind of remind myself of, that, you know, everyone is sort of has a finite resources, you know, a finite set of resources in terms of time and money and energy and care, and like, we all get to choose where to direct them. You know, and not having kids of your own means that you might have some to spare that can be sort of directed to another place.
I want to ask about feminism because you teach on that subject as well. And your book clearly covers a lot of that. Is feminism under attack right now? Is it going through some sort of change? Like, what's happening? I know it's a big question, but, like...
No, it's such an interesting question, and it's a hard one to answer. Because, so in my work since the book, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about sort of in, like, the trad wife universe, like moms on Instagram, the sort of Maha world. And something that I think is really interesting about sort of conservative women on the internet today is that they're no longer sort of rejecting the label of feminist. Like, I think maybe 10 years ago, feminism had a very particular definition, and it was like, it was about progressive politics. It was connected to, like, a particular stance on reproductive rights, on abortion, on sort of women in the workplace. And there is a really interesting sort of movement towards redefining what feminism means. You see some of these like very conservative influencers saying like, yes, of course I am a feminist. And that means that I'm rejecting this societal push towards needing to work in male dominated spaces. And instead, like being a feminist for me means reclaiming my femininity and having kids and baking pies at home or something. So I think that there is something really, really interesting happening with sort of like a co-opting of the term or a redefinition of the term at the moment. There's something really interesting happening.
I'm reiterating what you just said, but this idea that from a messaging perspective, right, they've taken, and when I say they, I mean just holistically when we talk about conservative trad wife, like those sorts of things, they almost seem to have taken ownership of feminism through a new definition, which is creating a blurred line between more conservative and liberal priorities. And I also think it's creating almost confusion or a weakness around what feminism used to mean as well. So I think that point is really fascinating, and it's interesting how what I imagine was a strategic political decision from the right has become part of like the zeitgeist and part of social media and part of there's the idea that you feel guilty if you don't have kids. You feel guilty if you're not home. And now it's like, oh God, I feel guilty if I'm not making pies homemade with, by picking my eggs from the chickens that live outside. And that reality is there too. So I think that's a really interesting point, and it'll be interesting to see how that evolves.
I remember one point that you raised in the book too, Peggy. Sorry, but just that. People who have kids half the time, not half the time, but there's some number of parents who truly neglect their kids. And some of them are because they're elite wealthy and they just, going back to traditional sort of wealthy families, like not raising their kids, having someone else raise them, and they're just like around generally for financial support and then boarding school. I mean, so having kids does not necessarily mean you're a parent, or an actual mother or a father. Mm-hmm. Anyway, sorry, but you were going to.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think something that's happening that within sort of this redefinition of feminism is that it is moving from sort of a collective politics of feminism, which was sort of advocating for women as a group, and to sort of this really individual definition of what it means to be feminist, which is like me living out my, like I as a woman get to decide what to do with my life, and I'm choosing to like have children and raise them in this context. Whereas like, in the 1970s, women were calling themselves feminist, and they were sort of calling for rights for all women, right? And I think like that collective to individual shift is happening like, in a wide range of places within American politics. You see that playing out in lots of different places. But I do really think that like this part of this shift of what people are sort of conceiving of it meaning as being feminist is from like a political advocacy for women as a group to like me self-actualizing as a woman. Mm-hmm. And that really strips it of its political power, right? And in some ways neutralizes it as a political threat, right? Like if all it means to be feminist is that like I get to do whatever it is I want, that's not a threat to broader structures or hierarchies of power or anything like that. So I think that's one reason why the word it's sort of been defanged a little bit and is therefore something that can be used across the political spectrum to mean something much, I don't know, softer, I guess.
Has anything about releasing this book surprised you? Like as far as the reception you've got, the audience, the media, the cultural response, has it been a smooth ride? Has it been what you expected?
I wrote this book going back to what I said earlier about sort of that we usually talk about having kids as a question of desire, as like a black and white thing. You want them, so you have them, and you don't want them, so you don't have them. And I think I never felt that kind of clarity. And instead, I always felt like the reproductive decisions that I was making or would make in the future had much more to do with the sort of the circumstances of my life and the other decisions that I was making and all of that. So I wrote the book to really focus on that gray area. And one of the things that really surprised me was that it brought me into contact with a lot of sort of the child-free community for whom that certainty is really there. And in particular, like younger women. You're not supposed to read the reviews, but like if you go on Goodreads and look at some of the reviews, it sounds like for a lot of younger women, my book felt like small c conservative for them. Like they wanted a celebration of this, like of this choice to not have children, which, I mean, that's not what a historian does. A historian doesn't really celebrate a particular,
You're just telling
life
the
choice.
truth, right?
Yeah. I'm trying to account for the past, but also it just, I was very surprised to find that like younger women don't necessarily seem to feel like it's as fraught as I'm an older millennial, like as it felt for me and for the women around me. And that was both, I mean, I think that was a quite heartening thing actually, to be like, oh, maybe I'm a dinosaur, and some of the angst that I felt and that I felt like, women around me felt is sort of lessening for younger women. So that was interesting. And the other thing, I could not believe how strong the reaction was from mothers, the positive reaction. I've done a couple of sort of NPR call-in shows, and so many of the callers would be mothers who would say things like, this was so incredibly validating for me to read because you accounted for all of the reasons why my life is so hard. And I think, it offered them sort of like an explanation for things that they were experiencing in their lives. I was very conscious in writing the book that I didn't want to sort of like deepen the divide between mothers and women without children. And I was sort of surprised to find how positive the reaction was from others.
Thank you for today, Peggy. This is really enlightening. I think a lot of people will respond to this in a really positive way. And they should read your book. Your book, again, let's get the book.
I have it on my lap again, Without Children. Right here.
Definitely recommend this book.
So we'll have a link to it on our site. But Peggy, anything else that you want to share or make sure you flag?
Just as in terms of closing, just to reiterate, one of the real revelations of writing this book was realizing that, we are all sort of subject to this society that we've built, and that we have more in common in terms of like the context in which we make our reproductive decisions than we think we do. And in fact, throughout history, people in power have attempted to sort of divide women, I think, as a way of sort of controlling them. And it seems to me that the way forward is really to sort of reject the idea that there has to be a divide between mothers and women without children, and that in fact, like supporting each other, which goes both ways. It's not just on people without kids to support mothers. I think it has to go the other way as well. But that, the only way forward to me, it seems, is to think about how we can create a society where we truly care for each other, and that sort of would help to solve both the stigma of people without children and sort of the weight that American mothers are carrying.
I think that's a great way to end.
We can hope and pray. That's a great note to end on. Thank you.
We can hope for this.
Really wonderful talking with you. Peggy Hevington,
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was wonderful to meet both of you.
Thanks for listening to Tripping Over Love. Subscribe now to make sure you get the latest episode, and drop us a comment or a question. See you next time.